Earlier this year, Moldova hit the international headlines after a pro-EU candidate won a second term, effectively confirming the country's path towards the EU. However, the biggest challenge for Moldova remains unmet: reintegrating Moldova's pro-Russian breakaway separatist region, Transnistria, which borders Ukraine and has been suffering a deep economic crisis since the start of the year. However, last week, reports emerged that Moldova is working with the EU and the United States on a plan to reintegrate the region, at the same time as Russia is apparently looking to build up its presence in Transnistria to put further pressure on Ukraine. So, in this video, we're going to have a look at the Transnistria crisis, whether integration is possible, and whether it will actually work. Who is the most influential person in the world? Each year we ask the audience to rank their top 10 most influential people across politics, media, culture and activism. And now it's time for you to have your say. Click the link in the description to cast your vote for our 2026 ranking. First, let's start with some context. Transnistria is a region in the east of Moldova that's been de facto independent from Moldova since the collapse of the Soviet Union. In late 1989, after the Moldovan SSR declared its official language to be Moldovan and fears that Moldova would reunify with Romania, ethnic Russians in Moldova massed in Transnistria and, a year later, declared themselves an independent Soviet republic, called the Pridnestrovian Moldovan Soviet Socialist Republic. Gorbachev annulled the declaration, so when the Soviet Union collapsed, Moldova claimed Transnistria as part of Moldova. But the Transnistrians didn't agree, and a war broke out between Transnistrian separatist forces and Moldovan police. Despite promising to withdraw its troops from Transnistria in 1999, Russia has never followed through, most likely because the region serves as an important Russian military base with easy access to southwestern Ukraine and Moldova. Meanwhile, Moldova has vehemently continued to claim Transnistria as its own, but Transnistria essentially acts as a separate state, with its own currency, passport and parliament. While not officially recognising Transnistria's independence, Russia has long acted as Transnistria's economic and political lifeline. Russia is Transnistria's biggest export market, and since 2005, Russia has provided free gas to the region, as well as pensions for about 150,000 Transnistrians. Russia maintains a permanent military presence of about 1,500 peacekeepers, and performs regular military exercises which Russia claims are about maintaining stability in the region. A massive majority of Transnistrians even favour accession to Russia. A 2006 referendum, for instance, found that 98% of Transnistrians were in favour of potential future accession into Russia, and every Transnistrian leader since the Soviet Union has expressed support for eventual Russian accession. Now, since the early 2000s, there have been intermittent attempts at resolving the Transnistria conflict, but with little progress. In 2003, the two sides came close to signing the Cossack Memorandum, a Russia-backed proposal to federalise Moldova that would have granted Transnistria extensive powers within a loose federation. At the last moment, however, Moldova made a dramatic reversal and rejected the deal. 2 years later, a new negotiation format was launched, the 5+2 talks, bringing in the OSCE, the EU and the US as mediators and/or observers. Yet the process quickly stalled when Ukraine raised concerns about large-scale smuggling across the Transnistria-Ukraine border. Talks restarted in 2012, but collapsed after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Meanwhile, Moldova has increasingly moved itself closer to the EU. It joined the Eastern Partnership in 2009 and went on to negotiate an association agreement with the EU, which was signed in 2014. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, alongside Kiev, Moldova's pro-European government, led by President Maia Sandu, applied for EU membership, received candidate status in June 2022, and declared Russia to be the single greatest threat to Moldova's sovereignty. Following Europe's lead, Sandu began phasing out Russian gas imports, and held a national referendum last year where the Moldovan electorate approved a new constitutional provision stating Moldova's intention to join the EU. This September, Sandu's pro-European government was re-elected, further cementing Moldova's trajectory towards the EU. However, despite all this political momentum, one fundamental question remains: can Moldova join the EU before resolving the Transnistria conflict? There are historical precedents for EU enlargement despite unresolved territorial disputes, such as Cyprus, the UK and West Germany, but Transnistria presents a more difficult case. It's difficult to imagine Moldova becoming an EU member while Russian troops are stationed on its territory. Earlier this month, EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas reiterated that the removal of Russian forces from Transnistria and elsewhere in Europe is essential for long-term regional stability. Sandu has acknowledged this, stating that her preferred scenario is to join the EU alongside a reintegrated Transnistria, rather than entering the Union first and attempting reintegration afterwards. To this end, last Wednesday, the Moldovan government announced that it's working with the EU and the United States on a plan to reintegrate Transnistria. Although the details of the plan aren't yet public, both because the issue is politically sensitive and because concrete proposals are still being developed, the plan will almost certainly centre on the withdrawal of Russian troops from the region. While Russia will undoubtedly not be too happy with this, especially as it's been reported that the Kremlin is now working to increase its presence in the region, Moldova does hold some significant leverage. Transnistria's economic situation has deteriorated rapidly over the past year, after Russia decided to halt gas supplies to the region, blaming Ukraine for its decision not to renew transit of Russian gas through its pipelines. The cut-off triggered a deep economic crisis. Energy prices have surged, exports have fallen, the cost of living has worsened dramatically, and the Transnistrian authorities have been forced to declare an economic emergency. As such, it seems at least possible that Transnistrian elites may ultimately concede and move towards reintegration with Moldova, especially considering that the EU has already offered energy assistance, and that the region's exports overwhelmingly go to EU markets, not Russia. However, even if reintegration does occur, there's still a handful of hurdles the Moldovan government will face. The first is financial. Out of a population of roughly 350,000, around 148,000 are pensioners, and about 62,000 are unemployed. Their sudden inclusion in Moldova's pension and social assistance systems would place substantial strain on the state budget. Another challenge is politics. Moldova would inherit a large number of pro-Russian voters from Transnistria, voters who could shift the political balance back towards the pro-Russian forces that Sandu has worked determinedly to marginalise. However, that being said, Transnistria's November elections saw a record low turnout, and around 30% of Transnistria voted for Sandu's pro-EU party in this year's general election, which is quite a significant change considering that voters in the region were always far more inclined to vote for the pro-Russian former communist parties. This is tentative evidence that at least some Transnistrians don't see the point in continued alignment with Moscow, now that Russia is no longer providing subsidised gas or meaningful economic support. Given the state of Russia's economy at the moment, a resumption of economic aid currently looks unlikely, which means Transnistrian voters may gradually become more receptive to the idea of a European future. Our magazine Too Long is now officially in stock, with this latest issue focusing on the reshaping of the Middle East. In it, we run through each country in the region to discuss how they're rewriting the next chapter of their story. From Qatar's growing global influence, who will govern New Gaza if Iran could dash for a nuke, or how Lebanon can disarm Hezbollah. This is a region we know a lot of you are interested in. So this latest issue dives deep with our real thoughts on the next era of this often troubled region. Not only that, we also have sections focusing on UK, EU and global news, including our full rundown of some of the biggest elections which happened around the world over the last year. There's also our interview with YouTube's Money and Macro on how to fix the EU economy, the rise of the politician influencer, and the new left emerging in the UK. Subscribers to Too Long automatically get 20% off every copy as long as they stay subscribed. But as a special Christmas offer, you can get an additional 30% off your first issue if you use code December25 at checkout.